PST Covid update. We just wanted to take the opportunity to hit refresh on some of the guidelines that have been in place for quite some time now, and also advise you of some of the tweaks that we've made to our risk assessments and protocols moving forward into the new year, so we can continue to keep everybody safe moving forward. I'd like to thank everybody, whether you're a player, whether you're a coach, whether you're a parent, volunteer, for your support so far in relation to this COVID crisis. We've had to make some tough decisions. We've had to continually change our guidelines and our policies. It's been frustrating with the stop-start nature of the season so far and the season before that. But unfortunately, that's part and parcel of the world that we live in right now. And our success as a football club I consider to be very high in relation to COVID. And that's thanks to everybody who's involved in the football club for making that happen. And I hope we can continue to count on everyone's support as we move forward into the new year. As you'll be aware, our current location means that we're in Tier 4. And in terms of grassroots, that means from the government guidelines, DCMS guidelines that have then been passed down to the FA and the LFA, that we're currently only able to offer outdoor provision. So that means matches and outdoor training. Currently, indoor training is not permitted under Tier 4, and therefore any teams that train indoor, unfortunately, at the moment, either cannot train, or if managers have been able to find an alternative venue, although I imagine they're at a premium at the moment, then obviously training can move outdoor. But I think in most cases that will mean that certainly indoor training cannot happen as it stands. But we are allowed to continue with fixtures at the time of writing, and also outdoor training as well. So the change in tier has brought about a need for us to look at our risk assessments again and our policies and our guidelines now. And so I've taken the opportunity over the Christmas break just to have a look at those and refresh them, brought in some new guidelines that I think will help us moving forward in Tier 4, but also in Tier 3 as well. And I also thought I'd take the opportunity to refresh your memory on some of the others. So from a training perspective, as I've already mentioned, indoor training can't happen at the moment. Outdoor training can. Regardless of the venue, attendance record must be kept through the NHS app or through a parent rep taking it manually. We've got to track everybody. That's really important. When we're allowed to go back to training indoor, there'll be no spectators, the same as before. When we're outdoor training, we will allow one spectator per player. However, I would put the caveat to that if that's if it's necessary. I think the fewer spectators at training, the better at the moment, and therefore, if it's necessary, yes, we'll allow one spectator per player. But where possible, I'd like to keep people spectating to a minimum for training. Players to bring their hand sanitizer, that's already in the risk assessment and should be happening anyway. But I would ask the parents to take responsibility to make sure that part of the player's kit bag is hand sanitizer. It's one less thing for the coach to deal with. It helps with the efficiency of that process. However, coaches have got a spare supply provided by the club should they need it. All players should remain social distance where possible at training. Obviously, during play, that's a bit more difficult. But at any other time, we would ask that the social distancing measures are applied. We already have regular hygiene breaks as part of a session. Usually we call these a drinks break. I'm now putting in place a mandatory 2 hygiene breaks per session in an hour session. So there should be 2 deliberate breaks in play or in the session for players to practice hand sanitisation techniques. When coupled with the techniques before and after training, that means in that hour slot, they will have 4 opportunities to check their hands and etc. and make sure that there's a risk of transmission is kept to the absolute minimum. Also, as a mandatory now, all players should have, each individual player should have a clear area for their water bottle, their jumper, their boot bag, their hand sanitizer. That is absolutely vital to ensure that unnecessary transmission doesn't happen. And some teams have been successful with using a cone for each player with their name clearly written on, so that player has a base to go to. That means that there's less risk of equipment getting mixed up, and it also means that during the hygiene breaks, players are kept at a distance. So that is a mandatory requirement now for all training sessions. Equipment quarantine and cleaning procedures goes without saying. Once you've used it, clean it or don't use it again for a minimum amount of time. Mandatory is the limited use of bibs. So either coaches should either not use bibs at all and find other ways of players distinguishing each other from each other. such as half wearing match kit and half wearing training kit, or using the very minimum amount of bibs if it's absolutely necessary. Coaches should also avoid any practice that involves cues. So shooting lines, penalty shootouts, anything that involves players queuing up for a period of time for a turn shouldn't be happening anyway, in the way that we try and model ourselves as coaches, but especially at the moment where there would be an increased risk of transmission and interaction between players that's, to be honest, is avoidable. The next one that we've placed is contradictory to what we'd potentially ask under normal circumstances, and we're asking that players ultimately turn up to training as late as possible, or in better terms, as close to the start time as possible. We don't want players turning up 20 minutes, 15 minutes, even 10 minutes before training. Under normal circumstances, yes, absolutely. Especially if it's outdoor, it means there's extra training time potentially. But at the moment, while we're in Tier 4 in particular, we don't want players turning up early. Please wait in the car until maybe a minute before training starts, then make your way to your training cone that we've already talked about. Coaches only to clear equipment, and when dealing with first aid, coaches mandatory must be wearing a mask or a face covering moving forward if they're not doing already. Advisory for training, so not mandatory, but advisory, is that coaches wear masks when addressing the group at any time during the session. I would use kick-ins rather than throw-ins. Not only does it give us more touches of the ball, it also means there's less chance of cross-contamination through touching the ball with the hands. Try and reduce the number of stoppages during your training session. The more stoppages there is, the more the players interact, then therefore the more the risk of transmission. So try and avoid stopping the session too much, especially if it involves players huddling together. Use small-sided games where possible, so two 4v4 matches is better than one 8v8 match. There's less players on the pitch. They're also interacting with less players in the session. And if you can keep them on the same pitch through your practice design, then even better. And finally, a maximum of 3 practices per 1 hour session. If we're doing 5, 6, 7 different practices in a session, the players are mixing with different players, there's more equipment being used, there's more standing around and waiting for coaches to set up the next session, next practice. So 3 should suffice. And I would suggest strongly that coaches adopt a whole approach. So play games, then have a practice, then play games. That would be good practice anyway, but at the moment in particular, from a COVID perspective. Match day hasn't really changed much in terms of the absolute golden rules, with no exceptions, are 1 spectator per player, registering your attendance via the app or otherwise, and social distancing for spectators and coaches. They're all a given. New guidelines that we're bringing in are, again, asking players to arrive as late as possible, but obviously we're not saying, turn up at a minute before kick-off or even 10 minutes before kick-off. Coaches can communicate that with players, but we don't want players turning up an hour before or 45 minutes before. We still want them to warm up, we still want them to be prepared for the match, etc., but we don't want them turning up really early for games. We absolutely want parents to help set up pitches, etc., but we would ask that you're really responsible when doing so. So 1 parent in charge of the respect barrier, for example, at Colts level with the Samba goals, no more than 1 parent helping out with that per each goal, just to keep the chances of transmission as low as possible. Player area for bottles and jumpers as per training is now mandatory, and I would ask everybody to manage substitutes, particularly at the younger end of the spectrum where they tend to get a bit silly perhaps while they're waiting on the touchline, or start playing TIG or hugging each other or whatever it is they do. Just make sure we all keep an eye on our substitutes, that they're behaving and not interacting unnecessarily. And also when the players are inactive, half time, for example, making sure we manage that scenario at the best we can. And finally, just to reiterate, nobody has to play, nobody has to engage. It's each individual parent or player or volunteer's prerogative as to whether at the moment in the current Tier 4 or Tier 3 or any tier for that matter, whether they engage in club activity. We are permitted to do so and have been told to do so by the people who govern us, but ultimately it's up to our individual members what they do and don't do, and the club will support decisions from anybody in relation to that. What I would ask though is if anyone's got any related questions or concerns about COVID moving forward, that they dedicate them to the email on your screen, which will take you straight through to the club's COVID team, who will advise as best as they can with their limited knowledge themselves as volunteers around your queries. All right, so that's really important that you have that method of communication should anybody wish to use it. Thanks very much for your time. I look forward to your support and hoping we can continue to play in a safe manner and that we continue to enjoy our football and that we get some form of normality very, very soon. Thank you very much.